which set off the Mahayana from so-called primitive or original Buddhism. When the Buddha comes to be considered capable of adhisthana, the next step his devotees are logically led to take would be the idea of vicarious suffering or atonement. Giving power to another is a positive idea, while suffering for another may be said to be a negative one. Though this latter is strangely absent in the Lanka, the Gandhavayaha as well as the Prajnaparamita are quite eloquent in elucidating the doctrine of vicarious suffering. According to this doctrine, whatever suffering one is enduring may be transferred on to another if the latter sincerely desires out of his unselfish and all-embracing love for others to take these sufferings upon himself, so that the real sufferers may not only be relieved of them but escape their evil consequences, thus enabling him to advance more easily and successfully towards the attainment of the blissful life. This goes quite against the idea of individual responsibility. But really religious minds require this vicarious suffering for their spiritual life. To suffer or atone vicariously is still negative and fails to entirely satisfy our spiritual needs. The latter demand that more good must be done in order to suppress the evils which are found claiming this world for their own glorification. So the Mahayanists accumulate stocks of merit not only for the material of their own enlightenment but for the general cultivation of merit which can be shared equally by their fellow beings, animate and inanimate. This is the true meaning of parinamana, that is, turning one's merit over to others for their spiritual interest. As I said elsewhere, this notion of parinamana is not at all traceable in the Lanka, which is strange. The Lanka cannot be imagined to have been compiled prior to the Prajnaparamita, nor to the Gandhavayaha or Avatamsaka. If so, why this absence? How can this be explained? Buddha the enlightened and Sarvasatva the ignorant. To conclude this section, Buddhism is the story of relationship between the two groups of beings. The one is called Buddha, who is the enlightened, the Tathagata, the Arhat, and the other is generally designated as Sarvasatva, literally all beings, who are ignorant, greedy for worldly things, and therefore in perpetual torment. In spite of their hankering for worldly enjoyments, they are conscious of their condition and not at all satisfied with it. When they reflect, they find themselves quite forlorn inwardly. They long for real happiness, for ultimate reality, and blissful enlightenment. They look upwards, where the Buddha sits wrapped in his meditation, serenely regarding them with his transcendental wisdom. As he looks down at his fellow beings inexplicably tormented with their greed and ignorance and egotism, he is disturbed, for he feels an inextinguishable feeling of love stirring within himself. The feeling, now perfectly purified of all the defilements of selfishness, which embraces the whole world in pity though not attached to it. The Buddha leaves his transcendental abode. He is seen among sentient beings, each one of whom recognizes him according to his own light. Transcendental wisdom and a heart of all-embracing love constitute the very reason of Buddhahood. While the desire or thirst for life, and ignorance as to the meaning of life, and deeds following from the blind assertion of life impulse. These are the factors that enter into the nature of Sarvasatva, all ignorant and infatuated ones. The one who is above, looking downward, extends his arms to help. The other, unable to extricate himself from entanglements, looks up in despair, and finding the helping arms stretches his own to take hold of them. And from this scene the following narratives, psychological, logical, and ontological, unfold themselves to the Buddhist soul. 2. Psychology. What may be termed Buddhist psychology in the Lanka consists in the analysis of mind, that is, in the classification of the Vijnanas. To understand thus the psychology of Buddhism properly, the knowledge of these terms is necessary. Citta, manas, vijnana, manovijnana, and alayavijnana. To begin with Vijnana. Vijnana is composed of the prefix 6, meaning to divide, and the root jnana, which means to perceive, to know. Thus, Vijnana is the faculty of distinguishing or discerning or judging. When an object is presented before the eye, it is perceived and judged as a red apple or a piece of white linen. The faculty of doing this is called eye-vijnana. In the same way, there are ear-vijnana for sound, nose-vijnana for odour, tongue-vijnana for taste, body-vijnana for touch, and thought-vijnana for ideas. Altogether 6 forms of Vijnana for distinguishing the various aspects of world external or internal. Of these 6 Vijnanas, the manovijnana is the most important as it is directly related to an inner faculty known as manas. Manas roughly corresponds to mind as an organ of thought, but in fact it is more than that, for it is also a strong power of attaching itself to the result of thinking. The latter may even be considered subordinate to this power of attachment. The manas first wills, then it discriminates to judge. To judge is to divide, and this dividing ends in viewing existence dualistically. Hence the manas' tenacious attachment to the dualistic interpretation of existence. Willing and thinking are inextricably woven into the texture of manas. Citta comes from the root cit, to think, but in the Lanka the derivation is made from the root ci, to pile up, to arrange in order. The citta is thus a storehouse where the seeds of all thoughts and deeds are accumulated and stored up. The citta, however, has a double sense, general and specific. When it is used in the general sense it means mind, mentation, ideas, including the activities of manas and manovijnana, and also of the Vijnanas. While specifically it is a synonym of alayavijnana in its relative aspects, and distinguishable from all the rest of the mental faculties. When, however, it is used in the form of citta-matra, mind only, it acquires still another connotation. We can say that citta appears here in its highest possible sense, for it is then neither simply mentation nor intellection, nor perception as a function of consciousness. It is identifiable with the alaya in its absolute aspect. This will become clearer later on. Alayavijnana is alaya plus vijnana, and alaya is a store where things are hoarded for future use. The citta as a cumulative faculty is thus identified with the alayavijnana. Strictly speaking, the alaya is not a vijnana, has no discerning power in it. It indiscriminately harbors all that is poured into it through the channel of the Vijnanas. The alaya is perfectly neutral, indifferent, and does not offer to give judgments. Relation between the various functions. Having explained what the various important terms mean and what functions are indicated by them, let us proceed to see in what relationship they stand to one another. The whole system of mental functions is called in the Lanka cittakalapa or Vijnanakaya. Citta and Vijnana are here used synonymously. In this mental system 8 modes of activity are distinguished. Alayavijnana, manas, manovijnana, and the 5 sense Vijnanas. When these 8 Vijnanas are grouped together under 2 general heads, the one group is known as eye-vijnana and the other as Vijnana. But in fact the Vijnanas are not separable into these 2 groups, for perceiving is discriminating. When an individual object is perceived as such, that is, as solid, or as colored, etc. Discrimination has already taken place here. Indeed, without the latter, the former is impossible, and conversely. Every Vijnana performs these 2 functions simultaneously, which is to say, one functioning is analyzable into 2 ideas, perceiving and discriminating. But it is to be observed that this double activity does not belong to the alayavijnana. Another way of classifying the Vijnanas is according to their lakshana or modes of being, of which 3 are distinguishable as evolving, as performing deeds, and as retaining their own original nature. From this viewpoint, all the Vijnanas are evolving and deed-performing Vijnanas except the alaya, which always abides in its self-nature. For the Vijnanas may cease from evolving and performing deeds for some reason, but the alaya ever remains itself. The alaya, according to the Lanka, has 2 aspects. The alaya as it is in itself, which is in the Sagathakam called Paramalaya-vijnana, and the alaya as mental representation called Vijnaptir alaya. These 2 aspects are also known respectively as the Prabandha and the Lakshana. The alaya is incessant because of its uninterrupted existence. It is manifested because of its activity being perceptible by the mind. From this, we can see that the alaya is conceived in the Lanka as being absolute in one respect and in the other as being subject to evolution. It is this evolving aspect of the alaya that lends itself to the treacherous interpretation of manas. As long as the alaya remains in and by itself, it is beyond the grasp of an individual. Empirical consciousness. It is almost like emptiness itself, although it ever lies behind all the Vijnana activities, for the latter will cease working at once when the alaya is taken out of existence. Manas is conscious of the presence behind itself of the alaya and also of the latter's uninterrupted working on the entire system of the Vijnanas. Reflecting on the alaya and imagining it to be an ego, Manas clings to it as if it were reality and disposes of the reports of the 6 Vijnanas accordingly. In other words, Manas is the individual will to live and the principle of discrimination. The notion of an ego substance is herein established, and also the acceptance of a world external to itself and distinct from itself. The 6 Vijnanas function, as it were, mechanically when the conditions are satisfied and are not conscious of their own doings. They have no intelligence outside their respective fields of activity. They are not organized in themselves and have no theory for their existence and doings. What they experience is reported to the headquarters with no comment or interpretation. Manas sits at the headquarters and like a great general gathers up all the information coming from the 6 Vijnanas. For it is he who shifts and arranges the reports and gives orders again to the reporters according to his own will and intelligence. The orders are then faithfully executed. The Manas is a double-headed monster, the one face looks towards the alaya and the other towards the Vijnanas. He does not understand what the alaya really is. Discrimination being one of his fundamental functions, he sees multitudinousness there and clings to it as final. The clinging now binds him to a world of particulars. Thus, desire is mother, and ignorance is father, and this existence takes its rise. But the Manas is also a double-edged sword. When there takes place a turning back in it, the entire arrangement of things in the Vijnanakaya or Cittakalapa changes. With one swing of the sword the pluralities are cut asunder and the alaya is seen in its native form, that is, as solitary reality, which is from the first beyond discrimination. The Manas is not of course an independent worker, it is always depending on the alaya, without which it has no reason of being itself. But at the same time the alaya is also depending on the Manas. The alaya is absolutely one, but this oneness gains significance only when it is realized by the Manas and recognized as its own supporter. This relationship is altogether too subtle to be perceived by ordinary minds that are found choked with defilements and false ideas since beginningless time. The Manas backed by the alaya has been the seed of desire or thirst, karma, and ignorance. The seeds grow out of them, and are deposited in the alaya. When the waves are stirred up in the alaya ocean by the wind of objectivity, so interpreted by the Manas, these seeds give a constant supply to the uninterrupted flow of the Vijnana waters. In this general turmoil in which we sentient beings are all living, the alaya is as responsible as the Manas. For if the alaya refused to take the seeds in that are sent up from the region of the Vijnana, Manas may not have opportunities to exercise its 2 fundamental functions, willing and discriminating. But at the same time it is due to the alaya's self-purifying nature that there takes place a great catastrophe in it known as turning back. With this turning back in the alaya, Manas so intimately in relation with it also experiences a transformation in its fundamental attitude towards the Vijnanas. The latter are no more regarded as reporters of an external world which is characterized with individuality and manifoldness. This position is now abandoned, the external world is no more adhered to as such, that is, as reality. For it is no more than a mere reflection of the alaya. The alaya has been looking at itself in the Manas mirror. There has been from the very first nothing other than itself. Hence the doctrine of mind only, or the alaya only. The religious signification. The necessity of conceiving alaya in its double aspect, as absolute reality and as subject to causation, comes from the Mahayana idea of Buddhahood. If Buddhahood is something absolutely solitary, all the efforts put forward by sentient beings to realize enlightenment would be of no avail whatever. In other words, all that the Tathagata wants to do for sentient beings would never have its opportunity to reach them. There must be something commonly shared by each so that when a note is struck at one end a corresponding one will answer at the other. The alaya is thus known on the one hand as Tathagata Garbha, the womb of Tathagatahood, and on the other hand imagined by the ignorant as an ego soul. The Tathagata Garbha, therefore, whose psychological name is alayavijnana, is a reservoir of things good and bad, pure and defiled. Expressed differently, the Tathagatagarbha is originally, in its self-nature, immaculate, but because of its external dirt it is soiled, and when soiled, which is the state generally found in all sentient beings, an intuitive penetration is impossible. When this is impossible, as is the case with the philosophers and ignorant masses, the Garbha is believed sometimes to be a creator and sometimes to be an ego substance. As it is so believed, it allows itself to transmigrate through the 6 paths of existence. Let there be, however, an intuitive penetration into the primitive purity of the Tathagatagarbha, and the whole system of the Vijnanas goes through a revolution. If the Tathagatagarbha or alayavijnana were not a mysterious mixture of purity and defilement, good and evil, this abrupt transformation of an entire personality would be an impossibility. That is to say, if the Garbha or the alaya, while absolutely neutral and colorless in itself, did not yet harbor in itself a certain irrationality, no sentient beings would ever be a Buddha, no enlightenment would be experienced by any human beings. Logicalness is to be transcended somewhere and somehow. And as this illogicalness is practically possible, the Mahayana establishes the theory of mind only ontology and the twofold egolessness. In considering the theory of mind only, we have to be careful not to understand this term psychologically. Mind here does not mean our individual mind, which is subject to the law of causation. Absolute citta transcends the dualistic conception of existence. It belongs neither to the Vijnana system nor to our objective world. Therefore, in the Lanka this citta is frequently described in ontological terms. The most significant one is vastu, which is found coupled with tathata in one place, and with arya in another place. In the first case, vastu and tathata are synonymously used. What is tathata? That is vastu. Tathata is to be rendered either suchness or thatness, which is a term most frequently used in the Mahayana texts to designate the highest reality ever approachable by prajna, transcendental wisdom. Vastu in Buddhism is usually an individual object regarded as existing externally to the Vijnanas, and so is it in most cases in the Lanka also. But evidently in this connection where vastu is tathata, it must mean the highest reality. In the second case, in which arya is affixed to vastu, the arya must be a modifier here, that is, this reality is something to be described as arya, noble, holy, or worthy. The highest reality is also called something that has been in existence since the very first, or Puranasthitadharmata, p. 143, ll. 5 and 9. As it is the most ancient reality, its realization means returning to one's own original abode, in which everything one sees around is an old familiar object. In Zen Buddhism, therefore, the experience is compared to the visiting one's native home and quietly getting settled. The Buddhas, enlightened ones, are all abiding here as gold is embedded in the mine. The ever-enduring reality is above changes. To be above changes means to remain in one's own abode, not to move away from it, and for this reason reality is known as self-abiding, or remaining in its own abode. Point 1. To keep one's own abode, it to be single, solitary, absolute. Hence reality is viviktadharma, a thing of solitude. Buddhakoti, limit of reality, which points to a similar mode of thinking. It is again ekagra, the summit of oneness, and this summit or limit is at the same time no summit, no limit, because this is gained only when one makes a final leap beyond the manifoldness of things. The more ordinary expressions given to the highest reality known as citta are tathata, suchness or thusness; satyata, the state of being true; buddhata, the state of being real; dharmadhatu, realm of truth; nirvana, the permanent, sameness, the one; cessation, the formless, emptiness, etc. From these descriptions it is found natural for Mahayanists psychologically to deny the existence of an ego soul or ego substance in the alaya, and ontologically to insist that the tragedy of life comes from believing in the substantiality or finality of an individual object. The former is technically called the doctrine of Pujalanairatmaya, egolessness of persons one, and the latter that of Dharmanairatmaya, egolessness of things. The one denies the reality of an ego soul and the other the ultimacy of an individual object. Superficially, this denial of an Atman in persons and individual objects sounds negative and productive of no moral signification. But when one understands what is ultimately meant by Citta or by Viviktadharma, the negations are on the plane of relativity and intellection. The term the middle, meaning the middle way, does not occur in the Lanka proper except in its Sagathekam portion. But the idea that the truth is not found in the dualistic way of interpreting existence, that it is beyond the category of being and non-being, is everywhere emphasized in the Lanka. In fact, we can say that one of the principal theses of the Lanka is to establish the absolute which makes a world of particulars possible but which is not to be grasped by means of being and non-being. This absolute is the middle way of the Madhyamaka school. Unobtainability. This going beyond all forms of dualism. However differently it may be expressed. Whether as being and non-being. Or as oneness and manyness. Or as this and that. Or as causation and no causation. Or as form and no form. Or as assertion and negation. Or as samsara and nirvana. Or as ignorance and knowledge, or as work and no work, or as good and evil, or as purity and defilement, or as ego and non-ego, or as worldly and superworldly, ad infinitum. This going beyond a world of oppositions and contrasts constitutes one of the most significant thoughts of the Mahayana. There is nothing real as long as we remain entangled in the skein of relativity, and our sufferings will never come to an end. We must therefore endeavor to take hold of reality, but this